you. It's good to be
Good to
here.
have you on.
Jacob, thank you. Yeah.
AKA Cognizor.
Cognizor.
Cognizor, that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you do the Both And podcast. You've been doing that for quite a while. You're one of the few people on Twitter who I think is not worsening the ecology. And I think we'll talk a little bit about that.
That's quite a compliment, actually. A lot of people are worsening the ecology for sure.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of people who are, improving it greatly. But I appreciate not being perceived as a worsener. I would just bury my head in the sand if that was the case.
I was thinking to open by asking you a question you probably had 100 times, which is what is a both and? But actually, I think it would be more interesting to talk about the memetic ecology straight up, because I was having this conversation with Tim Adeline last week, and we were talking about what does like a proper exercise of responsibility toward the ecology look like. And I was kind of weighing these two standpoints that I've been wrestling with in myself, which is like, on the one hand, kind of going through these cognitive pathways of having like an idea, a propositional idea come up, and then like sort of testing it and realizing it's not going to improve things, or tweeting it and then deleting it occasionally, but mostly like vast majority is filtered out. And then I just kind of think like the medium doesn't afford me the capacity to communicate like non-linear ideas, or to communicate the connections between things, or to give to communicate sort of warm data with integrity rather than cold data. And it's like, even when I'm trying my mostness, I'm finding myself drawn into rivalrous kind of things. But you, I know, have sort of struck the other pathway, which is to try and craft a memetic artifact, tweets and blogs and so forth, which open up doorways. And I think you also bring like you bring a personal self to it, and it feels as if you're kind of talking to, like the way you're tweeting to me, it feels like you're talking to like a smaller room of people. Very often the way we tweet is like the entire, like shouting at the entire world.
Right.
I mean, what's your philosophy? Like, how have you kind of wrestled with that?
Ooh, that's a big question. Well, I'll state right out that I've done things on Twitter that I'm not proud of, in terms of beefing with people, getting into arguments. I've done all of that, so there's that. But I think I've learned from it, and I actually, this is all kind of preface, but I kind of have a philosophy, this notion of memetic mediation, that, one valid part of memetic mediation is actually beefing with people sometimes, and having some tension. You don't want it to be so, you don't want to create these kind of irreversible breaks or fissures in relationships. So you have to be a little careful. But, I like to poke at people sometimes, and I like to put out sometimes what I know are partial perspectives to trigger people. And then I'll, both end the heck out of that and be like, well, yeah, you're right too, and so, I kind of have a whole, I don't want to say strategy, because a lot of it's just kind of like, I'm just responding to the moment, it's a lot of it's just kind of intuitive, but, in terms of building relationships and bonding, some of my closest relationships have been with people that I've, had some harsh words back and forth with. In terms of, let's see, I'm trying to figure out what the question is.
Well, what do you think the question, like, so
what is
maybe you
my,
could refine
well,
what's most
yeah.
interesting to you about it.
Yeah. Okay. Like, I think I kind of interpret the question is like, what kind of drives my approach to this digital online space? And this could be Twitter, this could be podcasts, you know, private. There's, you know, private chat forums, things of that nature. I think it's, for me, it's balancing. Uh, I do have, you know, very strong points of views in some areas, but balancing that with this, and balancing that with this notion of memetic mediation, where, you know, I also recognize, you know, at least in theory, that I have major blind spots, and we all have major blind spots. You know, we all, it's kind of the blind monk in the elephant situation, if you're familiar with that metaphor.
Where they're all touching the elephant, but they don't know it's an elephant.
Or they're all touching different parts of the elephant, and, you know, the person touching the tail is like, reality is like a bushy, you know, scratchy, you know, soft, feathery thing, and the person touching the tusk is, no, it's sharp, you know, it's, and everybody's fighting over the nature of reality with the big R, and perhaps, you know, we're all touching different parts of this reality, and if we could learn to communicate better, to have conversations, dialogos, we could get in touch with a, you know, collectively, you know, with a more complete view of reality. Of course, there's people who reject that whole premise, you know, the pluriverse people, and say, no, actually, we're all living in different realities, and that's kind of a very, in my opinion, that's a very kind of hyper postmodern way to view things. So that's just an aside. But you also mentioned kind of the personal elements, and, you know, I think, you know, I find very valuable, you know, knowing not just what people think, but who is the person that's having these thoughts, right? And so, you know, when I apply that to myself, you know, I do try to express, you know, kind of, you know, sometimes I just make outright propositional statements, and, you know, that's that. But I often, you know, I'm very, you know, I find phenomenology very important, and who is the person who's speaking, you know, where are they coming from, you know, what is their, where, you know, where are they standing, and just, you know, so that's kind of, you know, what I like to see, and so I try to, you know, express that in how I behave online, but it's also, you know, just in terms of contemplative practice, you know, in terms of spiritual growth, you know, development, things of this nature, it's important to be a little vulnerable, to express yourself, to, you know, to not be this detached third party, right? But to actually, you know, I'm trying to think of, I don't know if there's another way, you know, to say it other than what I already have.
Do you think that there's like a relationship between the coming forth with vulnerability and the fallibility of it, like where we're not kind of presenting as it, like it feels to me in the converse that the people who are coming forward as like trying to have like the bulletproof position and always be right are also like not necessarily personally like putting vulnerability on the line, especially that like big public 50 100K following kind of shit
Yeah,
posting.
right. Um, yeah, I think it could be viewed that way, and it would make sense. You know, for me, a lot of it's just kind of therapeutic, right? And so oftentimes I'm not expressing a little bit more personal, or just a phenomenological statement, right? Like I love, you know, I love speaking in metaphor. I love speaking metaphorically about the nature of how I'm experiencing of how I'm experiencing in that moment, right? It's kind of maybe a poetic inclination, and it's just kind of it's more of just an urge that it feels good to do that, and then of course I can make an argument that, this is what you're saying, of like that vulnerability is associated with fallibility. And I totally agree with that. But, that's kind of like a post hoc rationalization in a way. But I feed that rationalization back into my motivation for doing it, which is like, it feels good. And I think it's good for this whole memetic ecology as well.
Yeah, something about sort of more poetic language, and also artwork generally as art as a medium,
Mm-hmm.
which, so in the context of like the kind of memetic, like flaming dumpster of the last 2 weeks or so, I came across this artwork on Instagram by an artist whose name I can't, I'll throw it up in the show notes or something, but he did this really like evocative artwork, and it was kind of the original painting of George Washington that was painted for the dollar bill. And so allegedly this was kind of like painted, but then there was like a whole part of the canvas that wasn't colored because it was for the dollar bill painting. And then he's kind of moved that, and it kind of like moves seamlessly into like this picture of these like cotton picking plantation workers, like African slaves,
Right.
African American slaves. And what struck me about it relative to everything else that I had seen is that it seemed to hold all of the truth in the situation in some way for me, in a way that the memes didn't. And there's something about
Yeah.
the quality of art that's like interpretive, and provokes a more like interpretive, intuitive sense in which like
Mm-hmm.
in that painting I could like hold like all the pieces. Like it was, I could hold the pieces of like the greatness of the founding fathers, and I could also hold like the original sin of slavery and the life of the poor, who weren't that kind of aristocratic class and everything. So, and just another kind of piece to tag on with this. So I used to spend a lot of time in the kind of more political, like a lot of my Twitter world was politicians and journalists and think tank people.
Me too.
And so I had this notion that part of the reason things were going squarely was that the ecology itself was so hyper focused um, on news and kind of lacking any of the other aspects of life. Like you've been posting a lot of like nature and like day to day stuff. I wondered whether like having more art and having more of like other aspects of life in the domain wouldn't move it away from this, like, because right now it's like very rivalrous informational communication combined with very sarcastic humor. And that's basically the two parts that are allowed, and it creates a real cynical kind of
there's a lot of irony posting, sometimes what people call shit posting, and I think that's almost a reaction to this kind of very limited frame by which we can express ourselves on certain platforms. You can also, of course, you can get away with a lot of, you can embed your true feelings into things. Ironically, irony is kind of like a memetic vehicle to get your real ideas out there, but in a way that's it's not just threatening because it's supposed to be funny, right? And that's kind of what memes, when you hear about quote unquote memetic engineers and how they use memes, the idea is that it's basically a Trojan horse, right? Of your ideas. It's like the humor takes down people's defenses, and then you can plant your ideas there. But that's a little bit of an aside. I agree that, and I think one thing that I try and cultivate, and also the accounts I follow, is it is kind of like, again, the ecology metaphor is kind of dominant for me in many areas of life. So I might overuse it, but this kind of robust ecology of many different types of expression, to the extent that you can on social media, right? It's inherently, because it's disembodied, it's inherently disembodied to some degree. And so the extent that you can on a social media platform, being able to braid in propositional ideas, poetry, personal kind of reflections, vulnerability, aesthetics, you can just kind of, tie that in, into this kind of, I like this metaphor, braiding it in. That's, to me, that's something like if social media is going to be a useful contribution to the cultivation of collective intelligence, in addition to what I would call memetic mediation, like that's going to be what it is, right? It's going to be, the permission to be multidimensional, and not just multidimensional in terms of the contradictions we hold in terms of what we believe, which I also think, oftentimes we don't feel comfortable expressing contradictory ideas or contradictions, like you mentioned in the painting. But the ideal state is, both propositionally being able to express contradictory ideas and not knowing fallibility, but also, other modes of expression and being, which are these more personal aesthetic modes, I would say.
I keep on like circling back to try and think of a way of like renaming social media that will actually reveal what it is. And I keep failing in the endeavor, but I feel this urge that it needs to be like re-designated as like market captured network media or something like.
Right.
Like what you're describing is a beautiful articulation of what might be done within the constraints of
Mm-hmm.
of the, like, I don't want to be too polemical, but it seems to me that there's like fucking not enough people just talking about the constraints of the medium itself and how like lacking in ambition or vision, or like there's no artistry in the medium itself. And it's so we were talking before about kind of the different aesthetics of nature and man-made constructions. Facebook and Twitter is like a perfect epitomization of that, like rigid square, like lines, like everything, all information is passed through the linear scroll feed, whatever it is.
Right.
And there's no, like the things that designate what should be salient to you are such like limited metrics and also so subject to capture. Like I had notions that we might have something more like a web kind of, like a more natural sort of formation, because I'm sure at the level of like, if you're just looking at the, like I'm sure there's data scientists who map the network nodes of Twitter and actually it looks very like natural.
I've seen there people have done it and they've actually posted it online.
Yeah,
it's very there's a lot of, and I'm sure that the Twitter engineers do that all the time, and I'm sure they're always talking about how can we tweak the algorithms to to either encourage the memetic environment that we want to emerge. So this is kind of like the soft paternalism, or make money, right? And of course, I think what you're describing with Facebook and Twitter and other social media platforms is that it's and many people have discussed this, but it's optimized to harvest your attention, right? To sell ads. And so that is kind of like the elephant in the room in my mind in terms of the constraints of the medium is the overall goals of the system are not aligned with our each individual goals, right?
Yeah, when I see my dad on Facebook, or I think like a lot of people of the generation in there, the 40s, 50s and above, who have been captured by this medium, I think this is going to be looked back on like cigarettes sold to pregnant women in the 1940s or whatever. Like, it's going to be that, and it's holy shit, the amount of people just spending hours on this like informational slot machine, and the blue light of it is kind of like slowly eating away at your spirit,
Right.
But what might it be? I think at a more like philosophical, or at another level, if we think about the nature of reality itself, it's very rich, continually changing, continually revealing like what are the, like it has horizons which are always sort of tapering off into mystery, which you can see most apparently if you just go into nature and look anywhere closely. What might it look like if that was what the aesthetic goal of the information ecology was? What might it be to have something which intentionally is revealing the connections between things rather than giving you everything in a linear and aggravating fashion?
Right.
Like what if it would reveal, if it was revealing and there was like a tapering off, like I could see like, oh, I understand this domain, but then I can see the webbing of, like a Wikipedia kind of web of all of the related things and the history and going back in time and all of that.
Have you heard of Rome research? ROAM. It's kind of like this new hot note-taking software. It's associated with what's been termed second brain, kind of creating your own exocortex, and it kind of follows along what you're describing. It uses these hyperlinks that allow you to basically, kind of link back to, to different, you have a certain phrase or word, and if you're filling your notes and you're hyperlinking them, basically you're creating this web of knowledge. And later on, when you click on a term, it brings up all of the different, things you've written about in the past, and all the related associations with it, and you can visualize it graphically. It's not so much. I know you can create like public roams, and so I think they're working on making it more of a social media, the social interactive component. I think right now it's mainly individuals doing this and then sharing it with others. So there's, I definitely, what you're describing, I think a lot of the good news is that I think a lot of people are realizing what we're talking about and are working, to create an alternative. What comes to mind also is kind of, this whole suite of like peer-to-peer technology, right? That's explicitly against the advertising model of current media platforms that seems to corrupt, the incentive structure of basically the whole culture.
What kind of platforms are you talking about?
They're all kind of very in their incipient phase. I have in mind things like Holochain, perhaps also something like Urbit. Of course, Urbit is people are a little sketchy about Urbit because it's kind of the preferred platform of neo-reactionaries in general, and so people,
Which
but
I
in
have
terms of
no
just
idea what a holochain is. So if you could sort of.
well, I'm not an expert in Holochain. We did interview somebody, a commercial director of Holo, which is part of Holo, that universe. I'm probably not the best person to talk about it. I know on the Jim Rutt podcast, he recently interviewed one of the founders of of Holochain, and he can describe it a lot better. But I think the basic idea is that it's just more decentralized. So it kind of distinguishes itself from something like blockchain. Blockchain is kind of like more of a centralized environment where things go on the blockchain and they're there forever. And something like Holochain is more of like you own your own data, but you can share it with others and you can interact with each other's content, in different types of applications, both creative but also practical. For example, could be maybe used to cultivate a mutual aid network or respond to a disaster, something like that. But I am, in general, I haven't actually played with it with the software myself. So in general, I'm quite ignorant. There's much better people to talk to about that who I could recommend.
Yeah. So, as we're talking about this sort of like ambition or vision for what this like visualization that kind of corresponds somehow with our cognition, or at least some people's cognition, being drawn to that, and so it's kind of a strange thing to come to understand when you're kind of encountering these systems thinkers and other people who are doing like this multi-dimensional modes of thinking, or like working with sort of multi-dimensional objects within their own minds. Just the feeling of getting to like encountering something where you're like, how the fuck do I go about cognizing this?
There's another axis that I think is interesting here, and I've actually had some critiques of these second brain endeavors, or this kind of web of knowledge endeavors, and they're not like they're not deal breaker techniques, critiques, but for me it revolves around what is the optimal dynamic balance between embodied cognition of actually really deeply understanding concepts, letting it actually reorganize your cognition, and that's a very body process. It's the whole organism is restructuring. When for me, like if I have a really interesting insight, there's usually some kind of physical shift, some energetic shift in the body. And I mean, this speaks to kind of a more non-dual or an activist understanding of mind and body as being inseparable, right? And but my concern with the second brain stuff, even though I I think if this concern is addressed, then it's great, is that, you know, there can be a tendency, especially if you're a very disembodied person, you know, you're not in touch with your body, you're always in your head, that you're just kind of throwing things out there into this web of knowledge, you know, in order to, you know, with the intention that I'm going to come back to it and see the mystery of the universe, you know, somewhere in between these connections. But you're kind of offloading it. It's kind of like how, you know, how phones, because we can just Google everything, we're not actually, you know, we might without our phones actually be stupider, right? Because we're just so used to offloading our cognition to something else. And so I do worry about this offloading cognition, and, you know, and because it's digital, in some sense, it's disembodied. And so I think, you know, as long as there's this kind of iterative process of creating this kind of external artifact web of knowledge, which can be great, with actually, you know, allowing it to really change you, you know, it has to be both. And if it's not both, I'm actually very, very pessimistic about second brain technology in general. But if it is both, then I'm very optimistic.
Yeah, as you're saying, I'm just thinking about like really, really intelligent people that I've encountered who have these enormously complex constructions in their mind, but then like some sort of like festering emotional like fissure, and so the shifting in the emotional state, which is not being like worked with, could be like completely altering the way that they're relating to these models, in a polarizing way even.
And I can relate to that. You know, I think I spent most of my 20s in a very disembodied state. And I had a lot of cognitive dissonance and a lot of emotional blockages, is how it felt like. And well, one, I think I had this, there's this one, you know, I remember I was studying for an exam once, and I had this kind of very clear emotional blockage where like the right side of my head and face was like very contracted, and it had to do with like, you know, some complex related to guilt or something else. And I noticed that my problem solving capabilities, my creative problem solving capabilities, you know, was kind of blocked off. Like I couldn't, you know, like I could only kind of think very linearly, like, you know, if this, then this, then this, and I can kind of go down that way, but I couldn't actually kind of, you know, jump out of that system to look at it and see if there was like another way to approach it, you know, another lens. And I felt actually, because I had this, you know, this kind of psychological dissonance and also physical contraction, it actually reduced my ability to draw connections. So there's that. What was it? So there was one other thing I was going to say, but now it's escaping me. It was responding more directly to what you had said.
I mean, so that's spot on. That's spot on for me. Just like,
yeah,
if I think about, if you take it away from like how, you know, cognition about complex problems or the world, and you just think about your own mapping out of your own life's potential, when you're experiencing some emotion, or some fear or something which is causing that contraction, it really does have the emotional contraction contracts all of those possibilities in your like kind of branching mapping of all the potentials, and suddenly it's like this. And so as you're saying that, it's just becoming more and more clear to me how related the two of those things are. And also, well, you have to wonder how much of our seeming scarcity of possibilities for the future, like as a civilization draws from the felt embodied contraction that just comes from living in the society that we've made, combined with, you know, the trauma of all the world wars and industrial revolution and everything.
Yeah. Yeah, that's that. I think that kind of gets at the second thing I was going to say, which is just basically that, you know, the danger of social media, of second brain, even web of knowledges, is that it's kind of, it can be an excuse not to do self work, not to have a contemplative life, and not to actually, you know, become more integrated within yourself to different aspects of, you know, different sensibilities within yourself, different ways of being and modes of being. And I see that, yeah, is very dangerous for our culture, because, you know, you have this combination of the culture, and this is associated with social media, I think, of, you know, cultural evolution is speeding up, but it's speeding up in different directions. There's, you know, Robert Anton Wilson had this concept of reality tunnels, and I see right now there's what I call reality tunnel divergence, which is we're all kind of, and algorithms, you know, it's like algorithmically fueled. You know, we're getting into these certain reality tunnels, and other people are getting into their reality tunnels, and they're kind of diverging, right? And, you know, if you think of the analogy of, well, this is our collective brain, right? Society, you know, in human society in general is, you know, and the meme space is kind of our collective brain. This is just an analogy, you know, whether it could be taken literally is speculative, right? But, you know, it's very schizophrenic, right? And it's you know, if we look at the model of the brain itself, you know, if you don't have, you know, if you don't have different parts of the brain talking to each other, that's a recipe for disaster for the for the whole organism, right? And I kind of see that with, you know, with the direction that cultural evolution is taking, is that we're more interconnected than ever, and yet we're more disconnected than ever at the same time. And unless we can find a way to, you know, to start encouraging signals across these boundaries, you know, what has been termed memetic tribes, then I don't think we're going to make it. We're not going to, you know, but if we do, if we can figure out a way to facilitate signal transfer, I'm using very kind of mechanical analogies, but it's just basically means relating to each other, you know, relating to people from different backgrounds and histories and sets of trauma, and all of these things, you know, humanity is, well, I mean, in terms of ecology, we're driving the ecology of the planet off a cliff. But there's many other, you know, many other existential risks as well. But for me, ecology is the most salient.
As you were talking about that, I was just like, what would be, I mean, at the individual level, if you were working with that individual, you might give them a large dose of psilocybin or something in order to cause that sort of reconnection of all of the synapses and opening those new pathways. But then, you know, as with psilocybin therapy, you'd also want a kind of follow-up day-to-day integrative things that were kind of building more integration and attunement day to day. And I would like to see sort of how that maps onto the role of the memetic mediator, but also, yeah, I just want to really stress that, like, growing recognition I'm feeling that those things that I thought were unrelated to my intellectual understanding, things like dancing or drawing, creating art, have become like, it's become more and more clear how those are interrelated, and how like in terms of embodied cognition, like the ability to kind of like dance and like get into that, like really like have a feeling for those subtle rhythmic energies in the body.
Mm-hmm.
And now just thinking, well, maybe part of that psilocybin for the collective mind is something to do with a big dance type. A lot of the kind of cutting edge discourse, like the stuff that Jamie Wheal and others are talking about, is a kind of combination of these personal sovereignty practices and then like these collective ecstasis and catharsis kind of activities.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because this gets us into, you know, the role of religion, right? Because in the past, religion provided all of these services for people, right? And I think, in the last, the last number of decades, we've kind of thrown the baby out with the bathwater, right? All the way up to the new atheists, making their obscene statements about how religion is good for nothing and, worse than useless, and et cetera, et cetera. And, this is, I think, this might be, one of the questions about surviving the Anthropocene, so to speak, is, how, in one sense, it's kind of like, why did we in mass abandon religion? Many people still haven't, but at least of the more educated set, they have. And much of it was due to, developments in science and things of that nature. And so, the question is like, how do you integrate the scientific mode of being with the religious mode of being, right? And what is it about the religious mode of being and the cultural evolution of religion that was so adaptive for humans, right? It's my view that religion would not have evolved if it wasn't extremely adaptive, right, and completely integral to the evolution of culture itself, right? And it's, religious forms of expression are deeply embedded into our psychology, all the way to the evolution of our brain structures, right? And there's a lot of people who get way into this, and in modernity, if we've just kind of thrown out the baby with the bathwater, so not only thrown out the formal dogma, which is one thing, but thrown out the contemplative way of being, cultivating a contemplative life, cultivating virtue and community life, and a shared sense of aesthetics and beauty. That's a recipe for the meaning crisis, right? I know, like, John Vervaeke and others talk a lot about this. But it's, it's tricky, right? Because, religion in the past, has been based on a formal set of beliefs. And, and some critiques that I know that kind of neo-traditionalists have of these new kind of religion without a religionist, critiques that they would have of someone like John Vervaeke, is that, well, it's just not the same, right? If you don't actually have a set of beliefs to ground, to ground this kind of ecology of practice, then one analogy here is that it's like you can acknowledge that prayer has psychological benefits, but there's a big difference between praying because it has psychological benefits, and so it's more of a performative thing, to actually believing that there's somebody out there listening to you, right? And so the question is, can we develop a set of practices that that are as meaningful to the person who's praying, who actually believes there's a God listening to them in kind of the traditional monotheistic sense, right? And that's going to take a lot of creativity. Like I think that's the hard problem of, the religion of the future.
Yeah.
And I think, and you've mentioned psychedelics and psilocybin. I think, that, for me, like so I used to be quite religious. We were talking a little bit before. I grew up, around and participating in Native American church ceremonies, but I also I spent a lot of time, especially in my late teens and 20s, in the Baha'i faith. And wait, where was I going with that? I just lost my train of thought.
That's
Okay.
a fascinating
Yeah. Okay.
And
So I consider myself as having a very, in general, I have a deep religious sensibility. I resonate a lot with religious texts in general, and it's very meaningful to me. But I also have a, kind of a modern, scientific, skeptical mind as well, that I developed as I was kind of transitioning out of the Baha'i faith. But for me, in terms of like how can you have a meaningful, kind of set of practices that is not naive or is not, in contradiction with the latest science and things like that. I mean, for me, it's like I think there's a form of naturalism that is kind of broadly defined in terms of, I mean, just the statement that, we are a subset of the universe that's awake, becoming aware of itself. Like that's a statement that's hard to contradict in terms of kind of, in by, say, a new atheist or something like that. But it's something that to me is deeply meaningful, right? And if you actually grok and feel this notion that like I am, a part of the universe that's looking at itself, right, and observing itself, like that to me is like, I mean, that's far out, right? And yet it's not, it's not unscientific either. And I think, in terms of psychedelics, I think that's what kind of, at least in my experience, that's and in deep, contemplative or meditative practice, these peak experiences are these experiences of, what I would call broadly non-duality, of seeing, ourselves as not separate from nature or others, the environment, but kind of like, part of this kind of natural flow of nature, so that's when I say I'm kind of a, a naturalist, a non-dual naturalist, that's what I mean. Now, do I think that, the soul goes on after death, or, there's all of that stuff? Like that stuff used to torture me to think about. And now I just don't really care. Right. Like, for me, the notion of not existing, like if I've identified with the universe itself, then this particular lens on itself of the from which the universe is, or nature is observing itself, if that blips out, like that's actually not that big of a deal, because I'm more identified with the larger process, with the larger system, than with my own separate self. Anyway, that was all kind of a tangent.
Oh, this is a very rich vein. And try and hold all the different sub veins that came up for me whilst you're talking about it. But there's something about those non-dual states in which your selfhood becomes kind of melted into everything else. After you've had those experiences, and when you kind of frequently entertain your non-being, and it just completely changes your relationship to it. So whatever this new container is, that sense of like felt humility and relationship to mystery seems to me to be something that would be kind of fundamental and not, not at the cliche truism of something beyond, but the felt sense of something beyond. Try and take it all the way back. Now, it was something about, so, I mean, this question for me has been perhaps realizing as things go on, kind of central to my life as well. I grew up in a Christian community until I was like 9 or 10. My dad was like super involved, like a minister, and I grew up, it was kind of 80s, 90s, like Christian rock, and like a lot of like this stuff.
Yeah.
Then I went through the whole thing of agnostic and new atheist, and then kind of finding my own way to something akin to spirituality through an altogether different path, kind of like yourself and people like John Vervaeke, where you've kind of gone and you've had these mystical experiences with psychedelics, but also you delve into practice and you delve into philosophy, some sort of integration of Eastern, of Buddhism, of Buddhist ways of thinking, and then eventually seems to be a return to and a revisiting to the Christian lineage. But for me, I've kind of conceived of that increasingly in a developmental sense as like when you kind of have the family and you have the father of the family, and the father in this case is kind of Christianity or the Christian lineage. And I've kind of viewed it in the sense of like, there's a kind of necessary rebellion against, or moving away from home to like establish oneself. And then you can kind of like, when you grow older, you tend to sort of revisit your childhood and revisit your past and so forth. So, I mean, without downplaying the situation that we're in collectively, it seems to me that what happened in the Western lineage was something like we pursued truth to the point of killing God. And there are other traditions where that didn't happen. If we kind of conceive of religions as memetic complexes, like really, really rich memetic complexes that go down to the level of how you wash and how you pray, and what you do with marriage and how you relate to one another, how you do taxation, how you conduct yourself in war. I spent many years kind of trying to understand Islam and modernity and how the two interacted. And Islam is like all-encompassing by nature, so you really get the sense of the memetic organism. But in that case, for me at least, it felt like the orientation of the memetic complex was towards its own maintenance rather than pursuit of truth. Like it wouldn't kill its God in pursuit of truth, so to speak. So, setting that fiery topic aside, it's immensely. I mean, so the last thing I'll just add is that kind of revisiting after having gone through the going away and the questioning and the total skepticism to the point of rejection and the finding spirituality in other places, and then coming back, is what I've found is much more of an appeal of sort of archetypal and like artistic. Like I found the value of like literature concerning religious topics much more than scripture, and the kind of like all of those like cultural layers that we've built of like artistic interpretation and nuance and storytelling as like a much more appealing way to relate to that. And I've got no desire to go back to that kind of like scriptural inerrancy. Like the idea of an inerrant text to me is like a disaster for any kind of cultural evolution.
Right. Yeah, it's a difference between a living tradition and a dead tradition, or a continuing, a tradition that's within kind of the husk. It's within a dead vessel, so to speak. Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting. We can get into like the whole discussion of scriptural interpretation and stuff, and there's. You mentioned you grew up as a Christian, and I know, and you probably know a lot more than me about this, but there's certain passages that talk about, you shall now add to this book. Whoever adds to this book is, basically a blasphemer. But then you have also analogies of like new wine and old wineskins, right? And basically, and the way I interpret that's from, Jesus. And basically the statement is you can't put new wine in old wineskins. And the way I interpret that is that you can't put kind of a new revelation of truth into an old structure, right? A set of institutions, religious structures, and I think certain religions have adapted much better than others, right? And I know a lot of people are kind of. We had a person on our podcast who also grew up. He grew up Baptist, went down the new atheist track, and now he's an Orthodox Christian. But he's very nuanced about it, and he loves Vervaeke, and he's part of this whole kind of sense making community, and it's for him. It's like there's this interesting dialectic of. He would say, I'm not, I accept like the Nicene Creed or, whatever the equivalent of that is for Orthodox. I'm not sure if it's the same. But how it's, I think he would say like how it's interpreted, how it's related to, is kind of, an ongoing process, and so there's also this concept that I really like of enabling constraint, where, I think, one way to approach meaning making is you do give yourself a set of constraints, and this could be a set of religious constraints, but, because you have that, it actually somehow enables you to be more creative, because, it's kind of like it's focusing you in a bit, right? And you're able, you're actually, able to, at least according to this idea, you're able to do much more because you have kind of boundary object. I don't think is the right word, but you have kind of like this stable structure that you can relate to and continue to relate to. So that's one way to approach it. I think we need a plurality of experiments, right? Like, I mean, me personally, I just, I don't, these days I don't associate with any tradition. I have my own DIY set of contemplative practices that I've patched together from many different sources. And so I'm very DIY myself, but I don't think that's the path for everybody. And especially if you're trying to create community life, I think there needs to be this process of, and this process of developing new rituals and new sets of psychotechnologies, new ways of relating to each other. And it's really, it's really trial and error, right? Like a lot of these experiments have failed. You hear about the 60s and 70s and these communes and cults, and they didn't do so well. but the nice thing about today is that we have all of that history to learn from, and hopefully not repeat the same mistakes. But, I also think for some people, at least from a, bringing in a new term here, a meta-modern perspective, and this is akin, a developmentally meta-modern perspective. There's different uses of that term, but this is kind of akin to integral, right? Is that, there's these kind of stages of cultural evolution and stages of personal development. Now some people will argue that whether they're linear or not, and all of that, putting that aside, you're transcending, but you're also including. And, from my perspective, a lot of people have transcended, things, but they haven't included, and that's actually worse than transcending in the first place. Right. And a lot of people, like I think, for example, somebody like Daniel Ingram, he was talking about this on a podcast once. He's a pragmatic Dharma, really, really well-known meditation teacher. But he was saying, like, after a while, he was raised in like the sciences and kind of secular, and after a while, he realized he needed to reconnect with like his magical, mythic, self, right, and really explore those areas, which is, at least if you're looking at it linearly, is an earlier stage, but it still needs to be developed, and it still needs to be explored and brought into the present.
Yeah, I mean, that really feels congruent with the kind of like familial, personal life metaphor that we were playing with before, of like, you're not going to be a very well integrated person if you leave home, go to college, have all these new experiences, throw yourself into this new cultural milieu, and then you just like ignore what happened for the first 18 years of your life or anything. So it's like we have to know where we're from, and certainly in the context of the West now, it seems to me that that's a big raging issue underlying. I've heard a lot of interesting arguments that some of the kind of puritanical aspects of the movements we're seeing now is related in some way to the lack of consciousness of the Christian substrate, and that these are kind of similar to moments that were acted out in sort of medieval Christianity at various times, like splitting off, like the Anabaptists and stuff in Europe. But it does feel, it feels to me that there is this real, like, I can't remember what you called it, like a religious, what did you say at the beginning, that you had a religious sensibility? Well, just the desire to come into some sort of communion with a group of people in the full authenticity of yourself. If you can somehow work in everybody having relationship to cosmos as well, and like ecstatic bonding experiences, and like safety wires to avoid culty and exploitative behaviors kicking in. Oh my God, that would be great. That would be great. I've had like intonations of it and like little experiences on retreats and stuff, and it's just like you are able to realize like yourself in the context of being with these people, and like coming out there.
Yeah, kind of this feeling. I have a strong sense of this feeling as well from my Baha'i days. It's kind of like you're kind of all aligned. Like you're kind of all aligned towards a single purpose, while also, at least in the Baha'i context, respecting diversity. One of the phrases of Baha'i faith is unity and diversity, and so it's like this balance of finding this kind of commonality between us, but then not not using that to oppress individual expressions and, and individual explorations and creativity. And I think, when you see cult-like behavior, you see this, it's to me, it's like this imbalance of, or even political, when you see fascism or communism, in the 20th century, these are all examples of this kind of beatific vision that people had, but that vision was then, used as a blanket to smother, anything that could arise, that was outside of those very, strictures. And then, of course, you can have the other extreme imbalance of no coherence at all. I mean, for me personally, so kind of a little bit of my path. I mean, one reason why I was so attracted, after I kind of stopped being a Baha'i, I went through a few years of kind of agnostic and or nihilistic. And then I started getting involved with meditation and the pragmatic Buddhist scene, at least remotely. I was pretty isolated. I was just kind of doing my own practices. Was that it didn't require a set of beliefs a priori. It was all about, what is the nature of your experience? Like how, what is, like, instead of describe your beliefs, describe your phenomenology. Right. And that was a really useful phase for me to go through. Whereas now, I'm also coming back around to an interest in, mythology and mythos and the creation of new mythologies, and a religious sensibility. But it's coming from a more playful place. Like, it doesn't have the same existential seriousness that it did in the past. And I think a lot of this was kind of, to a significant degree, overcoming fear of death, much more than I had, before. And, that kind of freed me up of being okay with non-existence, the idea of non-existence or death. That freed me up to kind of joyfully engage with, with our, kind of collective inheritance, which is all of these really dense metaphors and stories that have guided, the evolution of human culture for thousands of years, and still have a lot of wisdom, even if they need to be brought into a new context.
That was a really big insight. Really big one. Holy shit. Just like the notion of the weight of the existential fear of the large body of followers of the main world religions is it's such a such a shaping and distorting, contortioning force on, it makes sense because that's in a sense what the religion serves to purports to respond to. But the fear itself must be the root of that such deep attachment to the form of the narrative. Any change to it is so threatening to one's own like ego almost. Mm-hmm. So if there was a way that we could like give people this, if you can get people past the gate, so to speak, through these experiences which don't require any doctrinal sign-up sheet, on the other side of that, then it's possible to have this more creative, playful thing, and kind of draw in like those understandings from fiction where it's like we're constantly paying tribute to, but also like things are changing and the like relationship to past is changing in present. And wow.
Yeah, I'll give you just kind of a story, a personal story. It's kind of an aside, but I remember when I was a few years ago, I was in my heavy meditation phase. I was gunning for what's called stream entry in the Theravadan tradition, which is basically, considered the first stage of awakening. And I had this deep fear, like whenever I felt like I was approaching that place, and there was like this, according to certain Theravadan traditions, there's what's called the progress of insight, which is basically kind of tries to map out stages you go through in meditation to, towards awakening. And I was noticing myself going, at least self-diagnosing myself through some of these stages. I could have been deluding myself, but this fear arose that, and this was kind of, baggage from my religious past, and of if I get stream entry, which is kind of like, one way to describe it is you kind of lose a part of your sense of self, right? My fear was that I would lose my soul. Like this was kind of some trickster demonic thing that was, basically encouraging people to give away their souls. And this was a deep fear. And it's also roots, so the Baha'i faith is not big on like, fire and brimstone, hell stuff. But even when I was a Baha'i, I was very engaged with, Christian text, because I had, I had a fear that, this kind of radical uncertainty, that what if these fundamentalist Christians are right and I'm going to go to hell for not, and that was a deep fear. And so, and that was even after I had been kind of agnostic, whatever, that the sense of like losing my ticket to salvation was still very much a part of me. And, and so one thing I started doing is I started doing these visualizations where I would imagine myself falling into the depths of hell, eternally, and like I would actually try and, mimic what that experience, actually like, imagining it and over again, to basically, get to the state where even if that happened, even if I died and, that's it, and non-existence forever, or, I get thrown into the pits of hell, like that would still be okay. Right. And so for me, it was quite a journey to get, to go through that process of, of kind of overcoming that existential weightiness of, if I need to get the right answer, I must, right. I must figure out the correct path. And, I had to go through this whole kind of sometimes harrowing process for me to get through that, where, now it's just like, it's, I still have anxiety and sometimes, and certain fear of death, but it's much more kind of manageable, and something that it doesn't drive my behavior, or my neuroticism as it did before.
Yeah. Do you have a feeling that that's like sort of, that fear that would not be there were it not implanted? Like in another sense, as you're raising children, that children could be raised to not be imbibed with this like how much of it do you put down to the actual theology that the kids are getting?
Well, we have to consider that, these belief structures evolved in the first place to serve a need, right? And so I think, and if we look at other organisms, the fear of death is pretty ever present, right? Like a rabbit does not want to die. It does not want to be eaten. It runs as fast as it can to get away. It feels fear, extreme fear, right? And so there's reason to believe that this goes very, very deep into our past, pre-human, probably to the origins of life itself, right? And so I think there is definitely, if you're raised with a hellfire and damnation context, that will definitely accentuate and reinforce it, and it will make it could make it more difficult. But I think even children raised in these ideal families or cultures will still have to go through their own process of their own existential process of perhaps differentiating themselves from the group, you know, and some kind of, you know, different traditions describe it different ways, but, you know, you can describe it as some kind of, you know, personal awakening where, you know, you to some degree you overcome this core existential fear. But, you know, without, of course, I think sometimes people critique like meditation as, oh, well, if you know, if you just become awakened and you're not fearful anymore, then you're not going to be very effective, you know, or you're just going to die because you don't have this natural fear response. And I think, you know, so the trick is to be able to, you know, like I think there's a difference between this existential kind of weightiness versus, you know, not being closed off from our humanity and still receiving, you know, those signals and allowing it to, you know, to direct you to more skillful behavior and to be responsive to your environment.
Yeah, I know you've got to dip out in a little bit, but if you've got a few more minutes, this is like verging on like a kind of central paradox or something that keeps like coming up in my conversations, which is how, and I think it's probably just down to language itself, articulating it, but it's like that sense of how do you have all of your skin in the game whilst recognizing the game itself or something like that. And then there's a sense I also see in the converse of like people who are holding on to the paradise notion, especially in contexts where it's like very real, like it's going to be me in my body in a house in paradise. That seems to like, well, it functions as a control mechanism as much as anything, but it seems to me reduces the skin in the game in some way, or at least it's like the skin in the game is oriented towards the achievement of that outcome rather than like in some way, like the embrace of death seems to bring on like, how can I fully manifest my self potential, creativity like in this life. I don't know if that was even a question. I'll throw it back.
Yeah. Well, you started with how do you have, you know, skin in the game while not being, you know, what the way I interpret what you're saying is basically how do you cultivate metacognition while being embodied? And this is kind of a favorite hobby horse of mine of the need to, like, you need to kind of, it needs to be a feedback loop of, you know, having some kind of this awakening that's kind of transcendent in a way, that's, you know, like, this is not me, this is not mine, this is just the flow of nature, you know, death is, you know, LOL death, right? Versus actually then you need to embody it and you need to actually, you know, do emotional processing. Like, this is something that I think a lot of, you know, kind of people gunning for awakening, enlightenment, et cetera, like, this is a mistake that's been made, is that there's not this reintegration period, this waking down, somebody has described it, where you do have to re-submerge yourself, you know, into your emotions, into, you know, and you need to be able to process them. But the difference from prior to, say, some kind of awakening experience is that there's still, you know, it's hard to describe. It's something, you know, I think that, you know, you really have to experience it to fully, you know, appreciate. But it's like there's still a part of you that is aware, right? There is still this metacognition of, like, you know, you're in it, but you're also observing it. So it's like you're embedded, but but there's still some kind of mindfulness, right? of what's happening. And you can argue that, okay, well, that's not full skin in the game. Perhaps you can argue that. But I also think that because you have that layer of meta awareness, or the witness, some people describe like witness consciousness, it actually allows you to dive into, like, if you're feeling really sad, to actually feel sad, to actually cry, to actually feel that, but in a way that's this sounds so instrumental, but in a way that's productive, and in a way that's actually leading to healing, and it's not just leading you down a kind of the self-reinforcing nihilistic feedback loop, right? Like there's some kind of guardrail. That's maybe one way to describe it, is like this kind of insight, metacognition, witness consciousness. It provides this guardrail where you're doing that until it's no longer necessary. But it's also, it's a guardrail from both falling into your own just kind of despair and depression, but also for bad behavior, right? You can be angry, you can be sad, but you're also able to channel that, in a way that's helpful for your own development, but also, for your responsibility as a family member, as a community member. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's a good answer to your question of like, is that really skin in the game? It's, things still hurt, right? Things still bother you. And there's almost like a sweetness to it, because you have that the kind of external perspective. There's almost like the sweetness to it, that you're allowing yourself to feel that, and you're doing it not because you're embedded in it so much as you're allowing yourself to be embedded in it. Not, I can't help but think of Robert Kagan, and how he describes from one stage to another is that, you transition from, something is part of the structure of your awareness, to something is within your awareness, right? And this is a similar, I think, heuristic to mindfulness meditation of, if something's within your awareness, it's still, in a way, it's still part of the structure of your awareness, and you still have access to that. But it's within a larger, more liberating frame. So that's a long answer to basically say I don't know, but
that's really lovely. It's becoming more clear to me as you're saying it, that just like having that experience of sort of ballooning out utterly beyond the confines of yourself, and then coming back in, it's like those dark corners of yourself and those like buried wounds and stuff.
Yeah.
That's no longer like this. Really, it's within this larger container, and therefore going beyond the self makes it like easier in the sense to come more fully into the truth of the self. And I think that's what you see with people who have these experiences with meditation or psychedelics, or they have a terminal illness and then they recover. It's like they are fully in the game with their emotions and like feeling everything fully, also with this silver lining awareness of its like ephemerality. So
yeah, and I think and it's actually conducive to more awakening, in the sense that from what I've noticed, and to some degree in my own experience, you can have an awakening experience, or even you can have a really mind-blowing experience on psychedelics. And so there's a part of you that all of a sudden has seen something that it can't unsee, but the rest of your psychology hasn't caught up, right? And so the whole waking down embodiment integration process is spreading that insight to more parts of yourself. And in order to do that, it has to kind of like dig into those parts of yourself, and have this kind of cathartic release, right? And to be able to have this cathartic release is easier if you have this kind of external perspective, because like it almost provides like a safe setting for it to happen, right? Because if you don't have that safe setting, then you're like, there's gonna be a part of you that's clinging on more, because like that's life and death, right? That's our trigger, kind of very biological response, is life and death. But if you have that external perspective, it gives you permission to dig in there into those really dark, traumatic, hurtful parts of ourselves, and really get in there, because we know that we have a little bit of a safety net. And so, and by doing that, I think that more parts of our psychology, and I think there's many layers, right? Can become awakened that way.
Okay, wow. Owing to a power cut, possibly by divine intervention, we had to wrap it up a few minutes early. But thanks very much to Jason for a very exciting, emergent conversation. And stay tuned. Got a lot of very interesting guests coming up over the next month. And sure to pick up this conversation with Jason another time.